Schulman. I'm the director of the Center for Excellence in Citizenship and Country Day. We are thrilled to have you all here, thrilled to be able to host an event with people in a place together. This is wonderful. We are absolutely thrilled to have Professor Roosevelt Kim, who is right here with us, his second visit with us. I think some of you were with us when he was here back in 2019, and he was talking about his book about the Supreme Court and Japanese American internment incarceration. And he had been toying with the nation that never was, and even talked to the upper school a little bit about that while he was here. So we were really excited when the book came out, and really excited to have him here. Excuse me, because the book has not formally come out yet, I'm not sure how many of you have, found a bootleg copy, but I can tell you this, I read it, and it is inspiring, it is empowering, it is engaging, it was a fantastic read in the doldrums between first semester and second semester, and continues to inspire me in my teaching, and so I'm real excited that we're here to talk to Kim and learn about the genesis of the book and what's in there, and we of course will be opening up for questions for you as well. I do want to say the books are for sale, $25 if you would like to purchase a book. We have a few.
You can actually be the first person to purchase a copy of the book. Sir, Professor Roosevelt actually held the book in his hands for the first time about an hour ago.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I've never seen it before.
And I want to hand things off. Before I do, I just wanted to say a word for our dear friend Sugata Das, who hosted us the last time in 2019. And he tragically passed away, as many of you know. And he was a great friend of the CEC. But we loved him, and we loved when he would host events and everything. So we've been talking a lot about him and thinking a lot about him, and I know that he is here with us, and he is just as giddy as he always would be at events like this. So for those of you who knew Dr. Das, just remember him, because we feel his presence is very much here with us. Our facilitators are Danny Brune and Tavisha Khanna. They are both seniors, and they think we were joking about it, but we're going back in the books right now and trying to change their grades so that they can't graduate. Danny is off to be challenged at Claremont McKenna College, and Tavisha is off to be challenged at Dartmouth College, but before it's college, right?
Yes.
Yes, before they go there, they are here to lead our discussion with Kim. And, well, you have your own introduction. Why don't you take it from there?
So let's get into it. So after reading some of the book, we would like to highlight a key idea in one sentence, which is, we are the descendants of the Union, a nation that rebelled against the ideals of the founders by abolishing slavery, and the better story allows us to draw a clearer line between the Civil War times and our current country. Do you think this is an accurate an accurate way to highlight some of your book, and how else would you briefly describe it?
Well, first, let me thank all of you for coming. Jonathan, for that great introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed my visit the first time so much that I was hoping I would have a chance to come back, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to more excellent students tomorrow. But I'm also delighted to be talking to excellent students now. So, yes, I think that is a good summation of a lot of the themes of the book. What the book is about is a little bit hard to say because there are different ways of thinking about it. And one way of thinking about it, which is sort of what that sentence was getting at, is like, who are we? Who are we as Americans? Who do we look back to as our ancestors intellectually, in terms of ideals? If you draw lines from different moments and different movements in history, what's the line that comes to us? And where do certain lines that we might think come to us actually go? And I almost feel like I don't want to give too much away because part of it is supposed to be a surprise, but I'll tell you anyway. The basic argument of the book is we tell ourselves a story that's fundamentally false and destructive. So there are two parts of this. It's false. And, you know, history is always subject to interpretation. I don't want to say that this is the truth that no one else knows and everyone else is just wrong. I don't think that's a good way of doing history. But I'm trying to give you a perspective on American history that I think is probably more persuasive and really does fit better with the evidence. And that is, we tell ourselves a story that connects us to the founding, and in particular to the Declaration of Independence. We have this idea that the Declaration of Independence states our modern American ideals of liberty and equality, and American history is sort of a process of trying to realize or live up to those founding ideals. And that, I say, is false, because those ideals just aren't there in the Declaration. Not in 1776, not in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration. We think they are now. We read the Declaration to contain those ideals, but that's really a different declaration. That's the declaration that was made by the abolitionists and promoted by the Republican Party, and maybe really in particular Abraham Lincoln. If you're looking for single figures, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King promote this idea of the Declaration, but they're putting in values that weren't there in 1776. And if you really think about what the Declaration is about and what its values are and where that line leads, you know, who the true heirs of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and founding America, who those people are, it's actually the Confederates. And we're connected to the United States. And I try to say United States rather than Union because there's this tendency to think about the United States as though we were the United States and then sort of we split apart and the United States didn't exist during the Civil War. People say North and South sometimes, and then it came back together. And that, I think, is a bad and destructive way to think about it. There's the United States, then there are traitors, and we fight a war. The United States fights a war against traitors, and the United States wins. So if you're asking who won the Civil War, the answer is the United States. But anyway, so founding America really leads to the Confederacy. Who are we the heirs of? The Reconstruction Congress and the United States Army in the Civil War, which totally transforms our political system in interesting sort of quasi-legal ways. This is a big answer. But I'm just saying, so one way of thinking this of the book is sort of like, who are we really the heirs of? Where do these different lines go? And then the other is, how can we tell the truth about American history and still feel good about our country? That's sort of the problem that I think we're facing now, and that's the problem that I'm trying to solve. And I'll leave you in suspense on that because maybe we'll get to that later. So without saying too much, that's another way of thinking about the book. I'm trying to solve the problem, how can we be honest about our history and still believe in our country?
Could you talk to us a little bit more about the war between inclusive equality and exclusive individualism? What are some of the modern parallels to the Confederates, and why and how are we the heirs to their union? I guess you've sort of gone into this a little bit, but...
Yeah, so as I was working on this book, I was thinking about founding America and its ideals and Reconstruction America. And what's the difference between those two political regimes or those two political ideologies? And the best way that I came up with describing this, and I actually, I asked people on Facebook what they thought. I wasn't on Twitter back then. I should have been on Twitter. I probably would have gotten better answers from Twitter. But I was like, if you have these two communities and these sets of ideals, how would you describe them? And exclusive individualism and inclusive equality was the best that the hive mind could come up with. So what this means is, exclusive individualism, the idea is you've got a political community that's closed, so it's exclusive. And you think of outsiders as different and dangerous, and you want them to remain outsiders. That's the exclusive part. And then individualism is, the point of government is to protect the rights of individuals. And government shouldn't arbitrarily interfere with individual rights. Government shouldn't, for instance, take from one person to give to another person. Government generally shouldn't redistribute. Certainly it shouldn't redistribute to outsiders. But even among insiders, redistribution is suspect because that's not the point of government. The point of government is to sort of protect your rights and then let people go about their business. So that's the exclusive individualism, which I think is the political theory, basically, of the Declaration of Independence. And then inclusive equality is a political community that is open. So outsiders can become insiders. And that's the inclusive part. So the idea is outsiders are not necessarily different, they're not necessarily dangerous, maybe they're like us, and maybe they can become valued members of our community. And then the equality idea is the purpose of government is to promote the general welfare, you could say, to make society as a whole better off. And sometimes maybe that does mean redistribution. If you have a lot of inequality, then the government can take from people who have a lot and give to people who have less, and you increase equality, and maybe that's a good thing overall. So it's a less individualistic and more communitarian perspective. And that basically is the political philosophy that I associate with Reconstruction. And if you look at our political landscape now and the rhetoric of the political parties, you can see one political party is much more exclusive individualist. Watch out for the dangerous outsiders who are trying to take the things that belong to you, and by the way, the government is taking from you and giving to undeserving people also, right? And you should be mad about that. That's the exclusive individualist version. And the inclusive equality version is saying, maybe we should let more people enter our community, and there's no one who's not a real member of our community, right? There's no one who's not a real American. Anyone who's born here is an American because the Constitution says so. And furthermore, the government should try to promote equality, and that's a good thing for the government to be doing. And of those two visions, I prefer the inclusive equality.
So the better story argues that the original sin of the standard story is slavery, which a lot of people believe was resolved by abolishing slavery. But the original sin of the better story, which is the one you're telling in your book, is that the redemption of the American Reconstruction era through the Jim Crow era. So the original sin of the better story is redemption. So then our question is, how does this shift into the retelling of history help Americans understand this history and the complex nature of racial relations?
Well, that's a big question. But maybe it's good to start with the history, because one thing that we don't give enough attention to in our history classes, although I'm sure that you learned a lot about it, is redemption. So we have the Civil War, we have the Reconstruction Amendments, abolishing slavery, giving people equal rights with respect to voting, and we actually have a functioning multiracial democracy in the South for a while. We have integrated police forces, we have integrated schools, we have social services provided on a scale never before seen, we have free health care. Lots of improvements, I would say. But all of this is imposed and sustained by military force. And when the will to maintain what's basically a military occupation of the South goes away, basically with the Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed election of 1876, by saying the Republican candidate gets to be president, but we're going to end the military supervision of the South. When the military supervision ends, you get basically coups, military coups, sweeping over almost half the country. Because white paramilitary organizations overthrow the integrated governments of the reconstructed states. And white supremacists take back control. And we don't talk about that very much. I mean, when I was in high school, we barely talked about Reconstruction. We didn't talk about how it ended at all, really. And what I'm saying about original sin is that should have a much more central part in our story, because the standard story that we tell ourselves And I haven't quite told you that story, but it's in the book. And it's probably familiar to you. It's this idea that our ideals are there in the Declaration of Independence, and we're gradually realizing them over time. Our standard story says, look, America has this original sin, which is slavery, because we have our ideal of equality in the Declaration of Independence, but we have slavery, which is inconsistent with it, and we sort of pay a price for that with the Civil War, and we redeem America by abolishing slavery. And that gives you a particular story about what's bad and what you shouldn't do. And the bad thing is slavery, right? So if you don't enslave people, then you're a good American. And you can say, hey, I'm not enslaving people. I never enslaved people. That's all in the past. We abolished it. Lots of Americans died to get rid of slavery. So now we're done. And I feel sort of unjustly accused if you make any demands of me in the name of equality, because I didn't do anything wrong. And if you think that the original sin is slavery, which is very actively doing things wrong, then it's easy to say, I'm not a wrongdoer, I have no responsibility for the state of racial equality in America. But if you think, actually we're not really founding America, right? We're Reconstruction America, then you get a different story of the original sin, because the original sin there is not actively doing things that are wrong, although some people are doing that, but obviously that's bad. The original sin for Reconstruction America is letting it happen. The original sin is not standing up and fighting for equality. And if you tell people that that's what they need to be on guard for, and what makes you a good American is actually standing up and fighting against injustice, then I think you put yourself in a much better position to ask people to make sacrifices for the common good, which I think is sort of the heart of Reconstruction and the heart of the Civil War. If you think about the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the song that the United States soldiers sing as they're marching, sing around their camps, it's "Let us die to make men free." So it's about sacrificing for freedom, sacrificing for equality. And if you contrast that to the revolution is all about people's ideas about their own rights. Their own rights are being infringed, we're being oppressed, the British are trying to make us into slaves. It turns out actually we have some people that we're holding as slaves, but let's not think about that too much. It's just a much better story in terms of who the heroes are and what the sin is and what we should not do and the lessons that we should take from history. Because if you think about Reconstruction and you think about redemption as the original sin, the message going forward is stand up and do more.
So how does the first redemption parallel the second redemption we're seeing right now?
Yes, so another thing about thinking about redemption is it gives you, I think, a better sense of the way that American history does sort of move in cycles. So there's the Civil War, and then the first Reconstruction, and then redemption, which basically sweeps away the gains of Reconstruction. And the 14th Amendment is a dead letter for almost 100 years because you've got segregation in the Jim Crow South, which nowadays we think obviously that's not equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment means nothing because blacks are massively disenfranchised through the South. And the Supreme Court basically says we can't do anything about it. Even the 13th Amendment doesn't mean as much as you might hope because there's convict leasing and vagrancy laws and lots of mechanisms to almost restore slavery in some ways. But then we get the civil rights movement and the Warren Court and federal anti-discrimination law. And what is this? This is the second Reconstruction. That's what historians call it. And when I read that, I was like, wow. Sort of light bulb moment. This is the second Reconstruction, and it's coming back. But of course, there's a reaction to that. And if you look at the rhetoric, the anti-Reconstruction rhetoric in the 1870s and 1880s, the anti-second Reconstruction rhetoric in the 1980s, it's the same thing. So Ronald Reagan, the Reagan Revolution, against the federal government, he says the scariest words in the English language, and this was just quoted by a federal judge. in an opinion. These are the scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And he talks about undeserving blacks taking government benefits. Exactly what they said during Reconstruction. Reagan's talking about welfare queens, driving Cadillacs. He's talking about strapping young bucks using food stamps to buy T-bone steaks. He kicks off his campaign with a speech where he praises states' rights in Philadelphia. And you're thinking, states' rights, Philadelphia, oh, is that 1776? Is that the revolution? Well, no, because it's not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it's Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is notable for the murder of civil rights workers 15 years earlier. So it's, I think, the second redemption. And I think it kind of starts with the Reagan Revolution in 1980, and you get transformative Supreme Court opinions, and then you get Supreme Court decisions that sort of push back against congressional power in some ways, like with the Commerce Clause. So a big theme of the Republican Party platforms in 1980 and 1984, I was just reading them, is like the federal government is too big and we need to push back against it. But they don't do a whole lot. If you look at like the past 40 years of Supreme Court decisions, they don't actually do a whole lot with, say, regulation of the economy, right? The Affordable Care Act almost goes down, but it survives. Where does the judicial pushback against federal authority really have teeth? It really has teeth with respect to Congress's power to enforce the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction Amendments. So, in a couple of cases that are kind of technical that maybe you're not that familiar with, the court pushes back against congressional attempts to promote equality, to protect women from violence, to protect religious freedom, although we're sort of seeing another cycle with that. So they push back against the 14th Amendment, and then they go for the 15th. This is sort of the more shocking, more recent thing. They're striking down the Voting Rights Act. So in the same way that like the 15th Amendment is the heart of the first Reconstruction, it's what they think will make multiracial democracy self-sustaining and allow us to go forward. The Voting Rights Act is the heart of the second Reconstruction, because that's, again, what really allows multiracial democracy to work. And now the Supreme Court is gutting it. And now we're seeing voter restrictions coming in again, just sort of as they did in the first redemption. So I firmly believe that the era of constitutional law that we're in now is the second redemption.
You state in your book that the standard story tells us that treason against your government is a show of American patriotism. Can you elaborate on how this connects to the Capitol insurrection?
Yes. So it connects to the Capitol insurrection. It also connects to the Civil War. So one of the things that people noticed when they were watching the footage of January 6th on TV was the weird costumes that people were wearing, right, and the flags that they were carrying. And some of that was just weird, crazy stuff. There was like the QAnon shaman who was wearing like horns and fur. I don't have anything insightful to say about that. And I don't really have anything insightful to say about the Trump flags, except that it should be very troubling in our system to see a flag with a person's name on it. Because the whole point of America is the Constitution, is what you take an oath to. It is not a person. So this idea of loyalty to a person above all is very troubling, very alarming, very anti-American. But what else did people see? They saw people dressed as like Revolutionary War patriots, which shouldn't be that surprising because this is the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party stands for Taxed Enough Already, which is anti-redistribution, but that's like a far-right movement that kind of co-opts Revolutionary War imagery. And then you also have the people with the Confederate flags. And some people are like, wow, that's crazy. You've got like the Revolutionary War patriots and the Confederates marching together. Isn't that weird? And I'm like, no, that's not weird at all. That makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense that they're marching together into the Capitol to try to overturn the existing political order, because that's all three moments exactly the same thing. The revolution is treason against the national government because people think that it's oppressing them and violating their rights. And maybe the patriots have some good complaints, but actually they weren't treated that badly, I don't think. I mean, not as badly as they were treating some other people. And that's the Confederacy, right? It's treason against the national government because they think that the national government is turning against their rights. And they had some valid complaints too, in terms of whether the national government was opposed to their system, their political system, because the national government, of course, had just been captured by the Republicans, because Abraham Lincoln had been elected. And Abraham Lincoln was opposed to slavery, and the society of the South was built on slavery. So they felt that they were no longer getting the deal that they had signed up for. The national government was going to threaten their rights. So they rebelled. And that's exactly the same thing that the people were doing on January 6th. They thought that the national government was oppressing them, and so they were rebelling. And it's all exactly the same thing, but it's not a good thing. So, you know, if you don't want to say that treason against the national government in defense of your kind of hysterical view of your own rights is a good thing, well, then you don't like January 6th, and you don't like the Confederacy, but maybe you also don't like the revolutionaries. And then the question is, well, where do you look in American history? Who are your heroes? And my answer is, your heroes is the national government that wins the Civil War. It's the U.S. Army. It's the Reconstruction Congress.
How do people who are indifferent to democracy and race relations play the role of bystanders to white supremacy?
Well, so that goes back really sort of to the question of redemption. And this is a dynamic that you see sort of in more or less extreme versions over and over again in American history, I think. Like, one of the things that I realized writing the book is there's just so many patterns. And I guess, like, if you look for patterns, you see patterns. And sometimes I felt like, you know, the guy with all the things up on the wall and the threads connecting them and so on. But over and over again in American history, you have a situation where there's something that is terrible and unjust. And some people like it, some people don't like it, but they need to get together, they need to work together. So the question is, what are we going to do about this terrible, unjust thing? And it turns out that the people who are in favor of it care a lot more. And they're willing to bargain harder, and they're willing to threaten to blow up the whole thing if you don't agree. And so you get a compromise that kind of favors them. So one, this happens with the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So there's a passage in the Declaration of Independence that a lot of people know about at the end, where it accuses King George of inciting domestic insurrections, which is to say slave rebellions. Many people also know there was more to that passage initially, because Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration also criticized King George for the international slave trade and for introducing slavery to America. So here you've got the Revolution, the colonies need to come together, it's a join or die moment, but there are people who think slavery is bad and people who think slavery is good. What's going to happen? It kind of looks to me as though Jefferson was trying to make a compromise. Right? Jefferson was saying, we will criticize King George for inciting slave rebellions because that's a terrible thing, but I understand some people don't feel so good about slavery, so we'll also put in a criticism of the international slave trade, which is not the practice of slavery in America, different thing. But what happened, the people who were pro-slavery felt very strongly about this and insisted that the attack on the international slave trade get taken out. The people who were anti-slavery didn't care that much, and also maybe thought that it was useful to frighten people with the specter of slave rebellions, because that would induce Southern patriots to join the revolutionary cause. So you end up with nothing about how the international slave trade is bad, but a very strongly worded passage about how terrible slave rebellions are. Same thing happens with the Constitution. You've got free states and slave states by the time the Constitution is drafted. So at the Revolution, every state is a slave state. Betsy Ross flag, 13 stars in a circle, every star represents a slave state. Interestingly, first flag of the Confederacy, 13 stars in a circle, every star represents a slave state. But the drafting of the Constitution, there are some free states, There are slave states, and they understand they have to compromise. If you look at the records of the convention, it's very clear the supporters of slavery care a lot more, because this is what their society is built on. And repeatedly they say, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to walk away. There will be no United States. So you get a bunch of compromises, and generally they tilt in a pro-slavery direction. And then, same thing happens with redemption. Reconstruction is divisive. It divides whites, which is the kind of division that people really care about in American history. And there's tension, and there's bitterness, and there's recrimination, and eventually the people who are not necessarily in favor of white supremacy just don't want to put up with it anymore. They don't want to bear the discomfort of trying to maintain a just society. And so they give up, and the people who care about it more, which is the Klan and the white supremacist paramilitary organizations, they win. And that's, just sort of what seems to happen.
So going, next question.
Okay. And so, how can the better story overcome the divide and bring us back together from extreme partisanship?
Well, I don't know if it can. I have my things that I try to do, like I try to talk to people in a way that reaches them and lets them reach their own conclusions and believe things that they've come up with themselves rather than me telling them things. I'm not 100% sure that it can. But what I say about that is you can tell a standard story where Thomas Jefferson articulates our deepest ideals, and the founding is this sort of Edenic time when Americans were united in support of these noble ideals, and the founding is where we should look, and we see the best America there. You can tell that story, but it's not actually as inclusive as people like to think, because a lot of people will look back and they'll be like, Thomas Jefferson enslaved his own children, and I don't really buy that he stated my ideals. And the founding was a world of pervasive white supremacy. And I don't really look back on that as the best time in American history. So you're marginalizing some people if you tell that story. You're marginalizing the people who find it difficult to say that Thomas Jefferson stated their deepest ideals. You're marginalizing the people who care about equality, race equality, sex equality. In lots and lots of ways, the founding is a bad time for equality. So that story marginalizes and sort of pushes out some people. Then there's the story that I offer, which is American identity is rooted in Reconstruction. And that's when our deepest values entered the Constitution and they were stated. And Reconstruction isn't perfect, but we're trying to be better than the past. We're not trying to live up to the past. We're trying to move forward. And that story also marginalizes people. Because when you